In April 1945, Field Marshal Walter Model was trapped inside Germany's dense industrial heartland. He commanded over 300,000 battle-hardened soldiers. His orders from Adolf Hitler were absolute: turn the Ruhr into an impenetrable fortress and fight to the last man. This defiance should have dragged the American army into months of apocalyptic urban warfare. Yet, in just a matter of weeks, this massive fighting force spontaneously dissolved, yielding the largest mass surrender of German troops in the entire war. If they were ordered to fight to the death and had the numbers and the terrain to do it, why did they suddenly give up? The sudden collapse of Army Group B is often misunderstood. It was not merely a spontaneous loss of German courage, nor was it simply the result of overwhelming American firepower erasing them from the map. What happened in the Ruhr Valley was the meticulous anatomy of a psychological collapse, engineered through calculated military isolation and relentless, suffocating pressure. The historical expectation was a bloodbath. This region was a dense, urban nightmare of steel mills, rail yards, and concrete factories, an ideal environment for a protracted, grueling defense. A cornered military force of that size, steeped in the propaganda of total war, was supposed to drag the Allies into a meat grinder, bleeding them for every shattered city block. Instead, that traditional expectation of a heroic, bloody last stand was met with a cold, systematic dismantling of the human will to fight. The defenders were pushed into a psychological corner where every passing hour confirmed their absolute helplessness, stripping away their resolve long before the battle reached its theoretical climax. The ultimate weapon used against them was the calculated deployment of hopelessness. How exactly did the United States 1st and Ninth Armies manage to spring this trap, shattering the psychology of a fanatical defense force and breaking their minds before the final apocalyptic assault even began? By the final week of March 1945, the Western Front had fractured. The great natural barrier of the Rhine River, which the German High Command had desperately hoped would halt the Allied advance, had been decisively breached. Through the unexpected capture of the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen and the massive, coordinated amphibious and airborne assault of Operation Plunder to the north, American and British forces were suddenly pouring into the German heartland. The strategic momentum was entirely in Allied hands. But directly in the path of the American advance lay a geopolitical and military obstacle unlike any other in Europe. This was the Ruhr Valley. It was not a traditional battlefield of rolling hills, open plains, or dense forests. The Ruhr was the industrial engine room of the Third Reich, a sprawling, densely packed megalopolis covering over 1,000 square miles. It was a suffocating labyrinth of interconnected cities, coal mines, towering slag heaps, deep canals, and fortified concrete factories. Places like Essen, Dortmund, and Dusseldorf bled into one another, forming an unbroken urban jungle bisected by elevated railway embankments that functioned like pre-built castle walls. For over a century, this region had forged the weapons of German militarism. Even in the spring of 1945, battered by years of relentless Allied strategic bombing, its heavy industry remained a terrifyingly potent asset. The Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, ordered a massive double envelopment to choke off this industrial heart. General William Simpson's Ninth Army swung hard around the northern edge of the industrial region, while General Courtney Hodges' First Army drove relentlessly to the south. Their objective was to link up deep behind the Ruhr, severing it completely from the rest of Germany. Caught directly between these two rapidly closing steel jaws was Army Group B. On paper, the force trapped within this developing pocket was formidable. It consisted of the remnants of several armies, including the 5th Panzer Army and the 15th Army. They possessed deadly 88mm anti-aircraft batteries that could be leveled to fire directly down city streets at approaching Sherman tanks. They had vast stockpiles of infantry weapons, Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets, and an intimate block-by-block knowledge of the urban terrain. Adolf Hitler had issued the infamous Nero Decree, demanding that the region's infrastructure be destroyed to prevent it from falling into enemy hands, while simultaneously ordering the military to defend the Ruhr as a fortress. But the reality on the ground was rapidly deteriorating. As the American pincers deepened, The logistical lifelines of the German forces were systematically severed. The fuel shortage became so acute that panzer divisions were forced to abandon intact Tiger and Panther tanks on the side of the road, or bury them in the rubble to act as static pillboxes. Ammunition deliveries became erratic, relying on compromised rail lines and horse-drawn carts, operating mostly under the cover of darkness due to absolute Allied air supremacy in the skies above. Furthermore, the internal cohesion of the German defense was unraveling. The sprawling, jagged nature of the Ruhr meant that physical communication lines were easily severed by bombing and artillery. Command posts struggled to maintain contact with frontline units. Field Marshal Model, historically a defensive genius known as the Führer's fireman, was famous for his energetic, hands-on leadership, often arriving at the front lines to personally direct counterattacks. But inside the Ruhr, his mobility was evaporating. He was a commander going blind and deaf, forced to rely on scattered reports and delayed motorcycle dispatch riders to manage a front that was collapsing inward from all sides. Compounding this military disaster was an overwhelming humanitarian crisis that neither side could ignore. The Ruhr was not an empty battlefield. It was a densely populated civilian center. Over 3 million German civilians, including women, children, the elderly, and tens of thousands of foreign forced laborers, were trapped inside the shrinking perimeter. These people had endured years of catastrophic air raids and were now living in the ruins of their cities, sheltering in damp cellars and massive concrete flak towers. Food supplies were critically low. The water infrastructure was shattered. Disease and starvation were imminent. For the German command, millions of panicked civilians clogging the roads made military maneuvering nearly impossible. Every street they intended to barricade, every factory they intended to fortify, was filled with desperate non-combatants. As the gap between the 1st and Ninth Armies narrowed to a matter of miles, the American command faced a brutal, sobering dilemma. They were on the verge of successfully corralling one of the largest remaining German forces in the West, but physically destroying them presented a strategic nightmare. The standard military doctrine called for a relentless, concentric assault to crush the pocket as quickly as possible. However, launching a prolonged door-to-door siege into the ruins of the Ruhr carried an unacceptable cost. American planners understood the grim mathematics of urban warfare. Fighting through the rubble of an industrial megalopolis would instantly neutralize the overwhelming advantages of American mechanized mobility and armor. It would force infantrymen into brutal, room-to-room, hand-to-hand combat against defenders who had nothing left to lose. Intelligence estimates suggested that a direct, full-scale assault into the core of the Ruhr could cost tens of thousands of American casualties. It threatened to become an American equivalent of Stalingrad, a meat grinder that would consume entire divisions just weeks before the war was universally expected to end. Beyond the immediate loss of life, a massive urban siege would act as a heavy strategic anchor. The broader Allied command was racing eastward toward the Elbe River, trying to secure as much territory as possible and prevent the remnants of the Nazi government from retreating into a rumored, heavily fortified Alpine redoubt in the mountains of Bavaria. Tying down hundreds of thousands of American troops to clear the Ruhr block by block would stall the entire Western Front. It would give the dying Reich exactly what it desperately needed: a tactical reprieve, a chance to reorganize its shattered lines elsewhere, and the time to drag the agonizing war into the summer or beyond. The Americans held the tactical advantage, but time was a weapon that could still be used against them. The German defenders were trapped, bleeding, and disorganized. Yet a direct assault risked immense unnecessary slaughter and threatened to derail the overarching strategy for ending the war in Europe. The American command needed a way to neutralize the massive pocket without walking directly into the deadly urban trap that Hitler was depending on. And the solution to this seemingly impossible dilemma presented itself the moment the steel trap finally, decisively snapped shut. On Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945, the steel jaws clamped completely shut near the small town of Lippstadt. Elements of the Ninth Army's 2nd Armored Division driving south finally linked up with the 1st Army's 3rd Armored Division pushing north. In that single historic convergence of muddy Sherman tanks and exhausted infantrymen, the trap was decisively sealed. More than 300,000 soldiers of Army Group B were now entirely cut off from the rest of the crumbling Third Reich. Every physical avenue of retreat, every rail bridge, and every highway leading east was instantly severed. Inside the pocket, the German command immediately braced for the inevitable. According to traditional military doctrine, the successful completion of an encirclement was merely the precursor to an immediate, merciless annihilation phase. The defenders dug deeper into the rubble, sighting their remaining 88mm anti-aircraft guns down the long avenues of Dortmund and Essen. They stockpiled their Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets in ruined factory cellars, fully expecting the massive American armored columns to plunge straight into the concrete canyons of the industrial basin. They anticipated a grinding, block-by-block bloodbath, the exact kind of brutal urban combat where their static defenses could extract a punishing, disproportionate toll on the attackers. But the expected tidal wave of American steel never crashed into the city centers. Instead, the Allied commanders made a highly unorthodox, deeply calculated decision. They stopped. Rather than charging blindly into the urban labyrinth and triggering the meat grinder that Hitler was counting on, American forces were ordered to halt their main offensive drives into the core of the Ruhr. They pulled back into highly defensible positions, establishing a rigid, heavily armed perimeter along the entire edge of the pocket. They methodically tightened the noose, securing key intersections, bridging sites, and peripheral rail lines to ensure the isolation was absolute. But they deliberately refused to take the bait of a deep, chaotic urban brawl. This tactical pause was highly visible. From their shattered observation posts, German officers and frontline soldiers watched American mechanized units dig in, set up overlapping fields of artillery fire, and simply wait. This sudden, deliberate suspension of the assault triggered an immediate and devastating shift in the German tactical mindset. If the Americans had launched a massive, coordinated attack, the defenders would have had a clear, immediate purpose: repel the assault, counterattack, and survive the next hour. In warfare, action breeds adrenaline, and adrenaline sustains combat cohesion. But the eerie, tense silence that settled over the perimeter replaced that combat adrenaline with a creeping, suffocating dread. The absence of a massive physical blow meant the trapped soldiers were left with nothing to do but measure the rapidly shrinking dimensions of their own doom. Stranded in a tactical vacuum, isolated German units could clearly see their ammunition dwindling and their fuel tanks running dry, all while a vastly superior enemy calmly observed them from a safe distance. The overarching, fanatical mission to defend the Reich as an impenetrable fortress degraded almost overnight. It was replaced by a localized, desperate instinct for basic survival. The waiting game forced every German soldier, from hardened veterans to terrified conscripts, to sit in the ruins and quietly calculate the absolute futility of their situation. The American forces had halted their main armored charge, but they were far from inactive. By refusing the physical bloodbath, they had initiated a vastly more effective strategy. They were pivoting to an entirely different kind of warfare, a campaign designed to systematically target the fragile psychology of the trapped men, breaking their will to resist long before the final assault ever began. The deliberate American decision to halt their main armored columns at the periphery of the Ruhr Pocket did not mean the offensive had ceased. It simply shifted from a ground invasion to a systematic strangulation. While the infantry dug in and secured the perimeter, the United States Army Air Forces and long-range artillery batteries began the meticulous dismantling of the Ruhr's remaining infrastructure. The goal was to transform the industrial heartland from a fortress into an inescapable prison. To achieve this, the Allies first had to eliminate the one asset Field Marshal Walter Model desperately needed to mount a coherent defense: mobility. The Ruhr was a heavily urbanized zone, but it relied on a vast, interconnected web of railway hubs, marshalling yards, and multi-lane highways to move troops and ammunition. Allied planners targeted these arteries with devastating precision. The colossal railway yards at Hamm, Soest, and Paderborn, previously the logistical pride of the German railway system, were pulverized by thousands of tons of high explosives until they resembled twisted steel graveyards. Key bridges over the Ruhr, Sieg, and Lippe rivers that had survived the retreating German demolitions were now systematically dropped by American dive bombers, fracturing the pocket into isolated, disconnected islands of defense. The immediate tactical consequence was catastrophic for Army Group B. Mechanized units like the formidable 116th Panzer Division found themselves trapped in a labyrinth of impassable rubble and cratered roads. But the paralysis extended far beyond the combat battalions. It struck directly at the brain of the German command. Walter Model, historically known as the Führer's fireman, was a general who commanded by presence. His entire leadership philosophy relied on extreme mobility, constantly flying to the front lines in his Fiesler Storch reconnaissance plane, or racing down highways in an armored staff car to personally organize counterattacks and inject his fanaticism into exhausted troops. Now that mobility was completely erased. Allied air supremacy was so absolute that any German aircraft attempting to take off from the few remaining improvised grass airstrips was instantly hunted down and destroyed by prowling squadrons of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs. Command vehicles, drained of their last drops of synthetic fuel, were abandoned in factory courtyards. Dispatch riders attempting to carry written orders on BMW motorcycles were strafed the moment they left the cover of the cities. Model was effectively anchored to his headquarters, stripped of his ability to see the battlefield or influence the fighting. He and his staff were pinned under the crushing weight of their own static defense, watching helplessly as their sprawling command structure was forcibly immobilized. This physical paralysis rapidly bred a profound, agonizing psychological crisis within the German officer corps. In the initial days of the encirclement, when the American tanks first stopped and dug in, many German commanders had experienced a fleeting sense of relief. They believed the pause was a tactical error by the Allies, an opportunity for the Wehrmacht to reinforce their strongpoints, zero in their 88mm anti-aircraft guns, and prepare the urban kill zones. But as the days dragged on with no massive infantry assault to repel, that initial relief soured into a creeping, suffocating anxiety. The defenders realized they were entirely cut off, not just from supplies, but from reality itself. The vast underground telephone network that connected the cities of the Ruhr, a network the German command had heavily relied upon to bypass radio interception, began to fail. Artillery strikes, relentless bombing, and the chaotic movement of millions of displaced civilians severed the buried cables. When the landlines went dead, German officers were forced to rely on radio transmissions, but the American signals intelligence apparatus was listening to everything. German radio traffic was heavily jammed, and whenever a command post transmitted for too long, American artillery would rapidly triangulate the signal and obliterate the transmitter. As a result, Army, Corps, and divisional commanders inside the pocket went completely blind and deaf. They lost contact with their flanking units, unaware if the battalion defending the next city block had been destroyed, had surrendered, or was still fighting. More devastatingly, they were entirely cut off from the German High Command, the OKW, in Berlin. The silence from the outside world was profound and terrifying. When fragmented messages did slip through the jamming, they only deepened the despair. Adolf Hitler, operating from the delusion of his underground bunker, transmitted orders demanding that the trapped, starving armies of the Ruhr launch massive, coordinated armored breakouts toward the Harz Mountains. To the officers standing in the soot-stained ruins of Essen and Dortmund, unable to scrape together enough gasoline to move a single medical transport truck across town, these orders sounded like the ravings of a madman. The psychological horror of their situation began to set in. They were highly trained military professionals, steeped in the doctrine of maneuver warfare, who suddenly realized they had been rendered completely irrelevant. They were no longer an army. They were simply heavily armed prisoners waiting in a cage, entirely at the mercy of an enemy who dictated the time and place of every engagement. The tactical void created by the American pause left the German soldiers with nothing to do but sit in the damp cellars and bombed-out factories, listening to the silence and contemplating the mathematical certainty of their own destruction. Recognizing that the physical and command isolation had primed the defenders for a mental collapse, the Allied command unleashed the Psychological Warfare Division, or PWD. This was not a secondary effort. It was a highly coordinated, aggressively executed combat operation designed to shatter the fragile remnants of German morale. The PWD understood that the trapped men were starving, terrified, and desperate for information, so they weaponized that desperation. The skies above the Ruhr was suddenly flooded, not just with high explosives, but with paper. Specially modified B-17 flying fortresses and frontline artillery batteries, equipped with 105mm base ejection shells, began blanketing the German positions with millions of leaflets. But these were not cheap, emotional propaganda flyers. The PWD understood the German cultural reverence for authority and bureaucracy, so they dropped the Passierschein, a highly official, legally binding safe conduct pass. Printed with the official seals of the United States government and bearing the signature of General Dwight D. Eisenhower, the pass was designed to look like a legitimate bureaucratic document. It guaranteed the bearer, in perfectly translated formal German, the right to surrender without being fired upon, immediate removal from the combat zone, medical care, and food according to the strict standards of the Geneva Convention. By making the document look official, the Americans gave the German soldier a psychological permission slip to stop fighting, transforming the act of surrender from a shameful betrayal into a logical, officially sanctioned procedure. But the paper barrage was only the foundation of the psychological assault. As night fell over the ruined industrial basin, the psychological pressure became terrifyingly intimate. The Americans deployed tactical sonic warfare. Specially modified M3 half-tracks and armored jeeps, mounted with massive, high-powered amplifiers, crept up to the very edge of the American perimeter, pointing their speakers directly into the dark, silent ruins occupied by the Germans. They did not broadcast generic calls for surrender. They broadcast highly specific, hyper-local intelligence that proved the Americans possessed absolute omniscience. A German soldier shivering in a trench would suddenly hear a booming voice echoing through the rubble, calling out his specific battalion number, naming his commanding officer, and detailing exactly how little ammunition his unit had left. The broadcasts would name the specific factory building the Germans were hiding in, and calmly explain that the American artillery had already pre-registered the exact coordinates of their cellar. The voices echoing in the dark offered a stark, agonizing choice. Send a representative out with a white flag within 20 minutes, or face a time-on-target artillery barrage. The psychological terror of these broadcasts lay in their absolute truth. The Americans were not bluffing. Through aerial reconnaissance, intercepted communications, and interrogations of earlier prisoners, they knew exactly who was in front of them. When a fanatical German officer refused the loudspeaker's offer and ordered his men to hold their ground, the exact 20-minute deadline would expire, and the sky would instantly tear open. A perfectly coordinated time-on-target barrage, where dozens of artillery batteries miles away synchronized their fire, so that hundreds of high-explosive shells detonated on the exact same coordinate at the exact same second, would obliterate the German position. The survivors in the neighboring sectors would watch the annihilation, realizing with cold clarity that the Americans held the power of life and death over every single square meter of the Ruhr, and that fighting back was not just futile, it was a mathematical impossibility. This crushing realization of American omniscience and firepower was magnified 1,000 times by the devastating visual contrast in logistics playing out in broad daylight. The Ruhr Pocket was not a remote, isolated jungle. It was a densely populated, urbanized area where the front lines often consisted of a canal, a railway embankment, or a single city street. As the American perimeter tightened, the distance between the starving defenders and the Allied rear echelons practically vanished. From their shattered observation posts and factory windows, German sentries were forced to watch the American war machine operate with a casual, terrifying efficiency just beyond rifle range. The sheer volume of Allied logistics was an assault on the German mind. Because the United States Army Air Forces controlled the skies with absolute impunity, American supply columns did not have to hide. They did not operate under the cover of darkness. Instead, endless convoys of GMC 2.5-ton trucks rolled down the highways in broad daylight, bumper to bumper, moving mountains of artillery shells, fuel, and supplies. At night, the Americans drove with their headlights blazing, projecting an aura of total invulnerability that mocked the blackout conditions forced upon the Germans. The men of Army Group B, who were surviving on a daily ration of a few raw potatoes, watered-down turnip soup, and bread bulked out with sawdust, watched through binoculars as American infantrymen in the rear casually lined up for hot food, drinking real coffee from tin cups and discarding mountains of empty C-ration cans. The Germans saw American mechanics casually replacing entire tank engines in the open, while they themselves were being forced to slaughter their draft horses for meat and abandon perfectly good Tiger tanks simply because they lacked 10 gallons of diesel fuel. They saw American medical units establishing massive, well-lit field hospitals with unlimited supplies of blood plasma and life-saving penicillin, while German medics were performing amputations in damp, unlit cellars without basic anesthetics or clean bandages. This visual disparity was perhaps the most lethal psychological weapon of all. It utterly destroyed the myth of German racial and military superiority. The propaganda of the Third Reich had promised the soldiers that they were the elite, fighting a decadent, weak enemy. But the reality displayed right in front of their eyes proved that they were a beaten, impoverished militia, facing a modernized, mechanized titan that possessed resources beyond their comprehension. The German soldier realized he was being asked to die in the mud not to win a war, but merely to slightly inconvenience a supply clerk who was eating a better dinner than the commanders of the Wehrmacht. Under the unbearable weight of this isolation, the psychological bombardment, and the glaring reality of logistical starvation, the internal cohesion of Army Group B finally began to fracture. The breakdown did not happen all at once. It was a localized, creeping rot that started at the bottom of the command chain and worked its way up. Field Marshal Model, trapped in his shrinking headquarters, was acutely aware that the will of his men was dissolving. In a desperate bid to maintain control, he issued draconian decrees, demanding that the Ruhr be defended house by house, and explicitly ordering that any soldier or civilian caught raising a white flag was to be shot immediately. He authorized flying courts-martial, roving squads of SS and Gestapo officers with the authority to hang deserters from lampposts, with placards around their necks as a warning to others. But intimidation loses its power when death is already a certainty. The threat of being executed by their own commanders began to pale in comparison to the visible, immediate safety offered by the safe conduct passes and the overwhelming American artillery waiting just across the river. Mutinies began to erupt, not as loud, violent uprisings, but as quiet, deliberate acts of disobedience. Platoon leaders and company commanders, regular Wehrmacht officers who recognized the absolute hopelessness of their tactical situation, began to secretly ignore Model's orders. When instructed to blow up civilian infrastructure, water pumps, electrical grids, and bridges, according to Hitler's Nero decree, local commanders simply threw the demolition charges into the canals. They recognized that destroying the cities would only doom the millions of German civilians trapped in the pocket with them, long after the military had been annihilated. As the communications network completely failed, battalion commanders realized They were the highest authority left in their isolated sectors. In the dead of night, ignoring the threat of the flying courts-martial, junior German officers began slipping across the front lines, carrying white flags made of bedsheets, to quietly negotiate terms with the American outposts. They offered to surrender entire city blocks, factories, and defensive strongpoints, provided the Americans promised not to unleash the dreaded time-on-target artillery strikes on their positions. In some sectors, the local civilian mayors and business leaders intervened directly, confronting the entrenched German military commanders and pleading with them to hand over the towns rather than subject them to an American bombardment. Model's once fanatical army group was dissolving into thousands of disconnected, frightened fragments, with individual commanders deciding that saving the lives of their men was more important than fulfilling a suicidal directive from a dead regime. Yet despite this profound psychological collapse and the localized, quiet surrenders bleeding the edges of the pocket, Army Group B remained a massive, heavily armed entity. 300,000 men scattered across a dense urban labyrinth constituted a formidable obstacle, even if their morale was entirely shattered. The psychological tactics, the leaflets, the loudspeakers, and the visible logistical starvation had successfully paralyzed the defenders, stripping away their will to launch counterattacks and rotting the command structure from within. But a paralyzed, hollow structure can still remain standing if it is deeply entrenched in concrete and steel. To finally break the deadlock, to transform localized mutinies into a systemic, official capitulation, and to force the ultimate surrender of the entire army group, the American forces could not rely on psychological pressure alone. They needed a devastating physical catalyst that would violently shatter the remaining defensive lines and prove to the German high command that the end had truly arrived. That physical catalyst was unleashed not as a reckless, all-out urban brawl, but as a series of surgical, mechanized amputations. In the second week of April, the static American perimeter suddenly sprang back to life. But rather than assaulting the fortified city centers head-on, American commanders launched careful, targeted probing attacks designed to exploit the weakest, most disorganized seams in the deteriorating German lines. Divisions like the 97th Infantry and the 8th Armored drove like steel wedges down the narrow industrial valleys and along the banks of the Ruhr River. Their objective was not widespread destruction, but rapid division. Moving with ruthless efficiency, American armor bypassed the heavily defended concrete factories and concentrated entirely on severing the remaining internal roads. By April 14th, these spearheads had successfully sliced the massive, sprawling Ruhr Pocket completely in half. What had once been a unified, theoretical fortress was violently cleaved into two separate, unmanageable fragments: a smaller eastern pocket centered around Iserlohn, and a rapidly collapsing western pocket encompassing Düsseldorf. This physical bisection triggered the final, catastrophic moral collapse of the defense. As the American wedges drove deeper, forcing German units into ever-shrinking perimeters, they packed the retreating soldiers tightly together with the region's 3 million trapped civilians. The local food supply system, already stretched to the breaking point, simply ceased to exist. For the German soldier on the ground, this created a crushing psychological revelation. For years, the Wehrmacht had been sustained by a strict code of military honor and the ideological conviction that they were defending the fatherland from annihilation. But as they looked around the cramped, lightless cellars of Essen and Wuppertal, watching German children starve and civilian refugees huddle in terror during every brief skirmish, that justification violently inverted. The American strategy of visible, overwhelming logistical supremacy, combined with these surgical strikes, made it agonizingly clear that the battle was already lost. Holding a defensive line, refusing to surrender, or firing a Panzerfaust from a ruined bakery no longer meant protecting Germany. It meant deliberately prolonging a siege that was actively starving and slaughtering their own people, all for absolutely zero tactical gain. The overwhelming presence of the suffering civilians stripped away the last fragile veneer of heroic resistance. Defiance was no longer patriotism. It was a meaningless death sentence for everyone involved. The pocket was now physically fractured. The men were starving alongside their citizens, and the ideological fervor that had fueled the war had completely evaporated. The defense had lost its soul. It was time for the final, decisive blow to end the misery, delivered not by an artillery barrage, but by a remarkably pragmatic letter. That letter was sent on April 15th by Major General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the United States 18th Airborne Corps, who recognized that the physical severing of the pocket presented a critical opportunity. He decided to bypass the disintegrating frontline command and strike directly at the psychological core of the enemy. Ridgway drafted a personal message, translated it into formal German, and had it delivered across the ruined front lines under a white flag, addressed directly to Field Marshal Walter Model. Ridgway's ultimatum was a masterpiece of psychological precision. He did not demand a humiliating political capitulation, knowing that any attack on Model's Nazi ideology would only harden his fanatical resolve. Instead, the American general appealed strictly to Model's identity as a professional military officer. Ridgway meticulously laid out the grim tactical reality. The pocket was split in two, supply lines were non-existent, and the defense was mathematically shattered. He then shifted the burden of responsibility, pointing out the horrific, escalating civilian casualties occurring in the crossfire. Ridgway challenged the field marshal's honor, stating that a true commander had a professional and moral obligation to prevent the useless slaughter of his own men and non-combatants once a battle was decisively lost. When the letter reached Model's isolated, dimly lit headquarters near Wuppertal, it triggered an agonizing internal crisis. The Führer's fireman was suddenly trapped between his rigid ideology and the undeniable reality of a completely defeated army. Model was a staunch Hitler loyalist who had fiercely condemned the German generals who surrendered at Stalingrad. His personal oath to the dictator and his inflexible interpretation of military honor explicitly forbade the act of capitulation. To Model, signing a formal instrument of surrender was treason. Yet the tactical reports arriving at his desk confirmed every word of Ridgway's assessment. He could not fight, he could not maneuver, and he could not supply his troops, but his twisted sense of duty meant he fundamentally could not surrender. The crushing pressure of this contradiction forced the field marshal to desperately search for a bureaucratic loophole. He needed a way to stop the senseless annihilation of his soldiers without officially breaking his personal oath to Adolf Hitler. If military law and his own ego prevented him from surrendering Army Group B to the Allies, he would simply erase the Army Group from existence. On April 15th, Model issued a final, unprecedented directive. He did not officially accept Ridgway's terms. Instead, he signed an order formally dissolving Army Group B. The decree was a legal and psychological escape hatch. It explicitly discharged the oldest and youngest conscripts from their oaths, granting them permission to discard their uniforms, blend into the local population, and return to their homes as civilians. For the remaining soldiers, Model's orders stated they were no longer bound by a unified command. He offered them the choice to either attempt independent breakouts or simply lay down their arms and hand themselves over to the American forces. He did not call it a surrender. He framed it as a necessary demobilization, born of logistical exhaustion. With a single signature, Model provided the exact legal permission his desperate officers needed to stop fighting without facing execution for treason. That one piece of paper instantly dissolved an entire military force, triggering the rapid climax of the Ruhr Pocket and sealing a remarkably dark, isolated personal end for its commander. With Model's final decree filtering through the fractured chain of command, the dam finally broke. The apocalyptic urban siege that the Allied command had so heavily dreaded never materialized. Instead, a surreal, haunting quiet settled over the ruined industrial basin. From the damp cellars, shattered rail yards, and fortified concrete factories, German soldiers emerged not with leveled weapons, but with empty hands. In a matter of days, over 317,000 men simply walked out of the rubble and into captivity. It was the largest single capitulation of German forces in the entire Second World War. The man who had ordered this quiet dissolution did not join them. On April 21st, Field Marshal Model walked alone into a dense forest near Lindtorf. Trapped by the fatal paradox of his fanatical oath to Adolf Hitler and the undeniable reality of his tactical destruction, he refused to face the humiliation of a formal surrender or a post-war military tribunal. Standing under the trees, he drew his service pistol and committed suicide, ending his life in the same isolated silence he had just imposed on his army. The collapse of Army Group B proved a definitive modern military reality. The Americans did not have to clear the steel mills of Essen or the streets of Dortmund block by bloody block. They demonstrated that the absolute destruction of an enemy's will to fight, engineered through logistical strangulation, severed communications, and the relentless, visible pressure of utter hopelessness, could be far more decisive than annihilating them in direct combat. Hitler had demanded the creation of an impenetrable fortress, hoping the sprawling megalopolis would become a meat grinder to stall the Allied advance and bleed the American infantry dry. But by deliberately refusing to plunge blindly into that trap, the First and Ninth Armies inverted the dictator's design. They used the sheer density of the industrial region against its defenders, transforming the greatest manufacturing stronghold in Europe into a massive, self-contained prison. The battle for the Ruhr was won not because the attackers were willing to die for every street, but because they understood that when a hostile force is fully cornered, the most devastating weapon is simply giving them the time to realize exactly how doomed they are. In the ruins of the Ruhr, the American army proved that the most devastating weapon against a fanatical enemy was not simply an overwhelming barrage of high explosives, but the calculated deployment of a tactical vacuum. They demonstrated that even the most deeply indoctrinated defenders, when denied the adrenaline of immediate combat and forced to quietly observe the mathematical certainty of their own destruction, will ultimately choose survival over a meaningless death.